What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The Washington Huskies are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what Washington did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for Washington. My projection for this team was 6-6, and then my prediction for them was also 6-6, and that's what Washington did last year. They did go indeed 6-6 in 2024 in the regular season, but if you count their bowl game loss at the end of the year to Louisville that they lost by 1 point, they went 6-7 overall. So a pretty realistic, prediction and projection last year for Washington, especially with all the changes that they had from a couple years ago. We knew it was going to be a step back year for Washington once they lost Kalen DeBoer to Alabama, but when Jedd Fisch came in there, did a pretty nice job in his first season, didn't really have the most talented roster and everything because they lost so many guys from the transfer portal and to the NFL draft, but they were still able to make it to a bowl game. So yeah, Washington coming off a pretty solid year in 2024. Again, just a big step back from where they were a couple years ago, and this also was their first year in the Big Ten. So you look at the schedule from last year for Washington. First off, in their non-conference schedule, they played Weber State, Eastern Michigan, and then of course they continued that Apple Cup rivalry with Washington State. They played that game in Seattle and they lost that game, and Washington State actually ended up being as good as we maybe didn't expect it to be. So yeah, that was kind of a tough game there for the Huskies. But then you look at their Big Ten schedule. We'll start with their home games first. They played Northwestern, Michigan, USC, and UCLA all at home last year in the Big Ten, so 4 home games in the Big Ten. And then on the road, they played at Rutgers, at Iowa, at Indiana, at Penn State, and then on the road at Oregon. So the road schedule was kind of tough. I mean, look at that road schedule. You got Rutgers and Iowa, 2 very winnable games, but they lost those 2 games. And then obviously Indiana. Indiana ended up being a surprise team for sure. We didn't know how good Indiana was going to be either, but then you had Penn State and Oregon both on the road. Those were obviously their toughest road games on this schedule. But yeah, that was a schedule from last year in 2024. What does it look like for 2025? Well, here is that schedule for Washington. Before we go game by game, let's take a look at who the Huskies play in their non-conference schedule for this season. So we know that they're going to be playing Washington State once again every year. Of course, the Apple Cup is still going to continue. It's not just, in the last game of the regular season. After all the changes they made from last year in this rivalry, it's now going to be held in week 3. So, yeah, they play Washington State again, and they will play them on the road. But other than that, they got Colorado State and UC Davis. UC Davis is an FCS team. That's a game that, Washington should be able to be big favorites in. And then you got Colorado State. Colorado State's not a bad group of 5 team out of the Mountain West. That might not be an easy game there for the Huskies, but it's still a game that Washington will be big favorites in. So, not a tough non-conference schedule. The Washington State game makes it a little bit tougher, but that's a rivalry game they play every year, I should say. So that's your non-conference schedule. Let's now take a look at their home games in the Big Ten. They will play Ohio State, Rutgers, Illinois, Purdue, and Oregon. So 5 home games in the Big Ten. Last year they just had 4. This year they got 5. Obviously, Ohio State and Oregon are your 2 biggest games on here. They are going to be really tough games here for the Huskies to win, but maybe they have a chance to pull off, a potential upset in one of those 2 games and one of those 2 matchups as well. And then obviously Rutgers, Purdue, those are pretty winnable games. They might be favored against Purdue, but I think that Rutgers game is definitely pretty even. Illinois could be a slightly better team than Washington this year. There's a lot of hype around this Illinois team. They could possibly be a top 25 team as well. So yeah, the home schedule is a little bit tough there when you got Ohio State and Oregon, but that's the good news. You get those 2 talented teams all at home this year. So that's your home schedule. Let's now take a look at the away games in the Big Ten. They will play on the road at Maryland, at Michigan, at Wisconsin, and then on the road at UCLA. So not a tough road schedule. Michigan obviously will be the toughest road game. They did beat Michigan last year. I'm kind of anxious to see what this matchup is going to be like again this season. Michigan might be better than Washington this year, but they did beat them last year, so maybe that's a close game. And then you got Maryland, Wisconsin, and UCLA, all very winnable games here for Washington. So not a bad road schedule here for Washington. Let's go back to the schedule now and go full game by game now for Washington. Again, they start things off with Colorado State on August 30th. Then you got UC Davis on September the 6th. And then they actually get a bye week before playing the Apple Cup. They'll go on the road to play Washington State on September 20th. I don't really like that spot for the bye week here for the Huskies. You kind of rather have it before having a big home game against Ohio State the next week. But yeah, they will play the Buckeyes the next week at home on September 27th. And then you got Maryland on the road on October the 4th. Then it's Rutgers at home on October the 11th. Then on the road at Michigan on October the 18th. Illinois on October 25th. That'll be a home game there for Washington. And then they get a second bye week. They'll get their second bye before playing on the road at Wisconsin on November 8th. Then you got Purdue on November 15th. And then you got UCLA on the road on November 22nd. And then obviously you're going to close things out with rival Oregon on November 29th. So this schedule is kind of back and forth. You know, you got your home game, first, and then the next week you go on the road. Then the next week again you go back at home, and then the next week again you go back on the road. So that's kind of how the schedule sets up here for Washington for 2025. Let's now get a projection here for Washington for 2025 as well. This is the scale I'll be using here for their official projection. Basically, if it's a 1% game in the red, that's pretty much counted as an automatic loss. 20% in the orange, they'll be about a double-digit underdog in that percentage. 40% in the yellow, they'll be a clear underdog in that percentage by less than a touchdown, like 6 or 7 points. And then your 50-50 games, those will stay in the white, games that really could go either way. And then your 60% games in the purple, those are games where Washington will be favored by less than a touchdown. 80% in the blue, they'll be favored by double digits. And then 99% in the green, that's pretty much your guaranteed wins and also your automatic wins. So we'll start with those easy wins here for Washington. I think you got a couple of them on the schedule, Colorado State and UC Davis. I think they'll be big favorites against UC Davis. I mean, at least by over 3 touchdowns. Colorado State might be a really a game that they probably could struggle in, basically in the first half. I don't think you want to sleep on that Colorado State team if you're a Washington team. So, yeah, Colorado State could be at that 90 to 94% range, while on the other side, UC Davis is probably, over that 95 to 99% range. Yeah, I think these two games are a little bit different. Maybe Colorado State is not a guaranteed win, but these two games are still counted as wins either way in this projection. So, those are your two easy wins for Washington. And then you got, you don't really have any other games on here for Washington that you should be favored by double digits. But I'm gonna go ahead and put the Purdue game in the purple for right now here for Washington. I think Washington clearly is the better team. Purdue obviously going with the coaching change. We don't know how good this team is going to be. So, yeah, it's kind of a new era and a new rebuild for Purdue again down there in that program. So we'll see how good they are, especially with a new head coach and everything. And don't get me wrong, I am a big fan of their head coach coming in, but I just don't think they're going to be really good. And plus, Washington is playing at home in this game. They should be favored by less than a touchdown, 6 or 7 points. If it was on the road at Purdue, it would definitely be in the white as a 50-50 game, but I'm going to put it in the purple for right now, and then we go to the games where Washington is going to be an underdog in. I don't have any games in the red or the orange, but I do have a couple of games here in the yellow where I think they're going to be about 6 or 7 point underdogs, and those are their two biggest games at home, Ohio State and Oregon. I think they'll be clear underdogs in both of those games. They'll be a less than a touchdown underdog by 6 or 7 points, somewhere in that point range. So yeah, Washington is definitely not on the level of these two teams, but they're playing them at home, so that does give them a chance here to possibly maybe pull off the upset. And what the difference is, they play Ohio State here in the month of September, and usually teams are not really better by that time, so maybe Washington struggles against the Buckeyes. Again, Ohio State and Oregon might not be as good as they were last year, but you look at Oregon, that's in the late part of November, and usually upsets do happen in the late part of November, so maybe they could possibly pull off an upset in one of these two games. Not saying they're going to, but they do have a realistic chance. Again, that's why they're both in the yellow, just because they're playing at home. So again, I think Washington will be 6 or 7 point underdogs in both of those games. Again, against Ohio State and Oregon, they'll be a 6 or 7 point underdog in those two games. And then that leaves you with 7 50-50 games. You got Washington State, Maryland, Rutgers, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and UCLA. Look, I know Washington State beat Washington last year, but it's a rivalry game. It's obviously going to be a 50-50 game. That's just a tough one to predict right now. And then you got Maryland. Because it's on the road, that's the reason why it does fall in the 50-50 range. I think Rutgers is a pretty even matchup. And I know Michigan is on the road. That probably should be in the yellow for Washington, but because Washington beat Michigan last year, that's the reason why it is in the 50-50 range. And then obviously Illinois, I think Illinois is probably a better team than Washington, but because it's at home here for the Huskies, that's pretty much the reason why it's a 50-50 game. Wisconsin, a pretty even matchup, same thing with UCLA. And because of that game's on the road, that's the reason why it does fall in the 50-50 range. So what does the projected record come out to be here for Washington based on how tough this schedule is? Well, we count the green games as wins, and then you average out that one game in the purple at 60%, average out the two games in the yellow at 40%, then you average out all these, 7 50-50 games at 50%. Let's say they probably win 4 out of the 7 50-50 games, and then they probably, slip up somewhere. Maybe it could be against Purdue there in the purple, or maybe they win just 3 out of the 7 50-50 games, and they probably pull off, an upset in one of those 2 yellow games against Ohio State and Oregon, and then you got your couple of green wins, and then your 3 50-50 game wins. So yeah, that's going to give you a projection, or actually a total of 6 wins, and that's what the projection is for Washington. So yeah, 6-6 projection here for the Huskies. I think that's a pretty fair projection based on how tough this schedule is. And again, if they probably win 3 out of their 7 50-50 games, they probably lose like 4 of those 50-50 games, and then they probably pull off an upset in one of those 2 yellow games there. That's going to give you a total of 6 wins, and they'll still be favored against Purdue as well. So yeah, Washington, I think the projection is 6-6, so the same projection as last year. 7-5, I would say, probably best case scenario, and then worst case, probably not making it to a bowl game at 5-7. If they do worse than that, though, like 5-7, or not like 5-7, but 4-8 or 3-9 or worse, then yeah, that's a disappointing year. But if they do a lot better than 6-6, that is definitely a surprise for sure for Washington. But that is my projection here for the Huskies for 2025. It is 6-6. Do you guys agree or disagree? Let me know your thoughts on Washington down in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and subscribe on the Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.